Good afternoon. Good. All right. Well, thanks, Joe. It is a pleasure to be here at the inaugural conference, the North American Conference on Education and Psychology. I've had the pleasure of working with Joe and his IAFOR colleagues, as Joe mentioned, for a couple of years, and I really appreciate the fact that the conferences are so highly international because of all the perspectives that are brought together. We learn so much from each other, and I think I come away learning more, than probably the people who listen to me. So I look forward to engaging with you, not only during the presentation, but later today and for the rest of the weekend. So with that, I'll get started. As Joe mentioned, I am a professor of instructional technology. That's sort of my first line of duty. So anyway, what we'll talk about today is I'm going to give you an overview of the history of research in our field, which has some of a shady past, I have to say, and talk about some of the issues and challenges that we've had in our field with regard to research design and what we've focused on in the past. Talk a little bit about some of the current research in the field, what we've been exploring, and as well as some of my hopes for the future. And anyway, and then we can chat a little bit. So we've always been interested, I think, for a long, long time, as long as we've had technology. We'll talk about how technology is defined here in a minute, but technology used for learning, there's been an interest in this for a very long time. And there's been a lot of research done both inside of education and outside of education. And Joe mentioned I've had the pleasure of working with a real wide variety of groups, and not just K-12 education, but in corporate training organizations and military organizations and government research agencies, and looking at how education with technology occurs in these environments has been greatly informative to me, but hopefully I can share some of those experiences and benefits with you as well. So anyway, we'll hit the highlights of educational technologies evolution first and some of the research, and then do a little thinking about how it might evolve for the better. Okay, so let me tell you a little bit about the field of educational technology. This I have to do because I'm a faculty member, right? I have to give you the history of everything, right? So bear with me. I think it's interesting, hopefully you will too, but educational technology has really been in use for quite a long time, Since we were able to draw in the dirt, we had media for learning, right? And then what I want you to notice here is sort of the speed of change, or how the pace of change sort of quickens as we move along in time, and it really correlates well with how Joe introduced the conference earlier. How many years time span would you say from when you were writing essays to when you were using technology daily? 2 or 3, right? So tremendous amount of change, and that happened, from just analog writing with a pen to typing on the computer to the full-blown use of the internet, to support instruction. That evolved very quickly. So you can see these kinds of patterns here, still with media being one of our trends here. All right. Okay, so you can see that the pace is getting faster and faster. We moved from the magic lantern to, I'm going to show you a picture of a magic lantern here in a minute, one of the first educational technologies with regard that led to the use of images and led to, I think, great interest in the examination of images for learning. So again, we're getting much quicker with the phonograph, remember records, and cameras, movies, radio and television. And then we bring in another thread into the field of educational technology, the thread of computing, which you might think computing really only came along back in the, in the 60s and 70s with the evolution of the computers as we knew them, but computing in it as a practice has really been with us for quite a long time, with the abacus, the early calculators in the 1600s, punch cards. Then we had the first electronic computers in the 1940s. But remember the mainframes? I remember my dad was an engineer for AT&T back in the 60s and 70s, and he showed me the first computer he ever worked with, and it took up about half of this room, you know. And the processing power, we probably have more processing power on our phones than they had on that giant computer. But just look at how far we've come in this time with what we can do with desktop computers and even just on our phones and access to the internet. Well, here's a third component of our history in educational technology. It's one you may or may not be familiar with, because I think when we hear the term educational technology or instructional technology, the focus tends to be on the technology component. And what I'd really like to draw your attention to today is another facet of educational or instructional technology, and that is the instructional or education component, the design component. Instructional design really got its beginnings in the early 1940s in the U.S. with military training needs. There was a need to train soldiers consistently and in mass scale, right? So we developed these systems with the help of educational psychologists, right? And along came B.F. Skinner and his technology of teaching to show us how we could do that very effectively using programmed instruction. Skinner was really the first, you may know, to create the teaching machine. So our first instance of programmed learning. And so along came the notion of instructional design. And then you may be familiar with Gagne and his conditions of learning. He brought these to bear on the instructional design process for us to think about in the 1960s. Okay, we have the ability to set some objectives and determine our course of action, but what are all the variables that influence learning? And so he delineated these for us quite well, with conditions that are still very valuable to us today. So in the 1970s, we had the height of programmed instruction. Do you know programmed instruction? Programmed learning. So Skinner really was at the forefront of this as well, but designing learning outcomes really based on user input, based on what the learner already knew. Prior knowledge would drive the path of the instruction. Well, if you can't answer this question, perhaps you need some more remediation, and so we go in this direction. So branching was designed into the learning experience to help the learner start from where they were, as you were talking about earlier, to come from where you are, what you already know, instead of having everyone start at the same point with what they may or may not know. Okay, so very customized, personalized learning. So the 1980s and late 70s, early 80s saw the rise of cognitive psychology, and then the rise also of computer-based instruction, these very large systems that would support personalized systems of instruction, which are still quite useful today and quite popular. And then in the 1990s, learning theory evolved even more to embrace the notion of constructivism, which from educational psychology is a very student-centered approach to learning, experiential, and really opened up learning to the use of authentic context, really emphasized making learning experiences relevant and meaningful to the learner. So again, focusing on that analysis component of design, which we'll get into here in a minute, thinking about what is the learner's prior knowledge, what is their background, thinking also about what the learner walks in with, as what we talked about earlier today. What is the cultural context? What are the social factors that influence learning, not just the prescriptive outcome we were hoping to reach? Okay, so these strands came together to create the field of instructional technology or educational technology. Okay, so we're influenced by these. All right, so because educational technology is the nexus of these areas, psychology, media, and computing or computer science, We really have great advantages brought together from all three of these perspectives. But unfortunately, the tendency in our field is to focus, again, just on the hard side of what we do, on the technology side. So with the exception of this flurry in the 1960s that Skinner brought along, 50s and 60s, the focus on programmed instruction, which was really emphasizing the design of the learning experience. Here's where we know great value lies, right, in analyzing the design component. The focus of our community research has been on technology itself as the silver bullet. You know, it's the answer to our educational problems. So I wanted to ask you, though, if technology is the answer, what is the question? What are we trying to figure out? So, why do you think this is? Why do you think we tend to focus on technology as the answer? I want to hear from you. Yeah, you.
Technology is just a method to reach something, the goal, education goal. So we need to focus on what's the education goal.
Exactly. Okay, great. And he's not a ringer. I didn't put him there. So that's exactly what I was hoping to hear. Technology is a means to an end. It is a device, it's a tool in our toolkit to help us, you know. So why do I dwell on this this not so glamorous past of the history of educational technology research? All this has happened before, and all this will happen again. A great quote from, I want to show you. I'm sorry, I'm ahead of myself here. Battlestar Galactica. Anybody watch this show? Okay, so good. So we learn a lot from history. There have been many more impressive people to make these kinds of quotes about how we should learn from history, but this is a great one. All of this has happened before, and all this will happen again. But really, we learn so much from history that we do need to stop and look back every now and then at what has happened and what we have learned so that it can inform the past, it can inform the future, I should say. Well, let's look a little bit at some of the research, or some of the claims of educational technology research. Okay, so back in 1850, when the magic lantern was first introduced, the educational value of media and technology began to be proclaimed, right? So this is a magic lantern. It showed images by using light in different ways. Of course, as electricity came along, the light became electric. But images were painted on glass in different ways and used for instruction. Okay, and then along came motion pictures, right? And so we had people claiming that even, film without sound, silent film, and then would probably replace teachers at one point in time. And then just imagine what happened when sound was added, how, really teachers were out of business at that point. And then there was a claim that books and film, and particularly sound film, talkies, would replace the teachers. Teachers would become obsolete. And so this quote from, Thomas Edison, pretty telling. Books will soon be obsolete in schools. It is possible to teach every branch of human knowledge with a motion picture. Okay? So surely this thinking wouldn't carry forward, right? Well, then along came radio. So then radio was the next salvation of education, right? The radio broadcast is one of the greatest educational tools which has ever been placed at the disposal of civilized man. Where is radio today? Actually, radio is quite popular for instruction in places around the world that don't have access to computing technologies or some more of the advanced electronic technologies that we've been using here in first world nations. Okay, this was 1935. So then along came television. Oh, you can imagine the revolution that television was going to cause. So the results of the studies outlined above give substantial evidence that television does an adequate and perhaps even superior job of teaching. 1956. So look at everybody sitting there watching television. Isn't that informative? Okay. So, very active, engaged learners. And then along came video discs and personal computers and tablet computers and mobile devices and so on and so on. So I'm not sure what's next, but I'm sure it's going to be better than what we already have, right? What is the problem? What's the problem here? I'm sorry? Yes. Right, there's no examination of the social context of learning. Any other issues? Right. So it's very focused on these sensory modalities, and that's it, right? The investigations, or the claims, I should say, at this point. That's it. The focus on what is being taken in, not what's done with it, per se. Okay, well, so there's a lot of interest in educational technology research because we're really interested in finding out the effectiveness question, right? Where's the impact? We want to know. We want to know because in 2012, spending on technology for learning, at least in the U.S., exceeded $56 billion. Okay, so most of it in higher education because we're, dishing out computers every couple of years, right? But a lot of it, or 36% in that era, was in K-12. Most of the funding goes to the hardware and the personnel to support it, but then the rest goes to computers, and other technology, software, professional development experiences related to software, and new tools for learning. So a tremendous amount of funding goes into K-12. This is just one environment, technology. So of course we have an interest in figuring out whether or not it works, right? But I think we really have to stop and ask ourselves, what are good questions to ask? Okay, so we're using all kinds of technologies for learning these days. Distance delivered learning is huge. Almost every university is offering distance courses, and of course there are all kinds of for-profit universities who specialize in delivering online education to those who cannot come to the university or don't want to give up their jobs or can't give up their jobs. They have to, if they're going to engage in these kinds of experiences, they have to engage in these ways. And then we have all kinds of technologies being used currently. Virtual worlds, games, games for learning are a huge emphasis now. Mobile learning with iPads and iPhones and MOOCs and flipped classrooms, oh my, it just goes on and on. So, and with each new technology and each new innovation, there's a renewed claim for this is the way that students are going to learn best. Okay, so with all the money and all the time and all the effort, we have to ask ourselves, does it work? But I'd like for us to step back for a minute and think, what does it mean when we ask, does it work? We're interested in learning about the variables that influence the creation of effective learning scenarios, right? But is that necessarily research? Can we learn from evaluation? And we can learn a lot from evaluation. And I would encourage you, when you look at the research in our area, to think critically about, is this research really, or is it evaluation? Because so much of what we do looks at specific instances of technology for learning. And there's nothing wrong with that, but we can't make generalizable claims about it. iPads are best for learning. No, we cannot say that because there's so many variables that go into the creation of an effective learning experience. So the research in our field began early, and as I mentioned already, as each innovation emerged and was researched, it was researched by comparing it to traditional instruction. What is that? What is traditional instruction? Is that the gold standard? It's all great, right? everything we do in the classroom is aces, top notch. So therefore, that's why we want to compare it, right? It's intuitive. It makes sense to want to compare it. So these kinds of studies are known as media comparison studies. And distance education actually produced some of the first media comparison studies back in the late 1800s, particularly in the U.S. when some of the first correspondence studies began out of the University of Wisconsin-Madison. We began looking at, how well students did in these distance courses or correspondence courses compared to those students on campus. Again, this is evaluation, but what does it tell us? Not much, really. I mean, what would be a better question to ask? Think of a better question? Better focus? Pardon? What do you think a better question to ask is, instead of comparing, how well do these correspondence students do compared to the students on campus? Yeah.
I think, basically, I think that the actual thing is that the student, the teacher, was delivering such a limited product that the medium became the message, as McLuhan said.
Right.
Simply because the message producer was so easily replaced.
Okay. Yeah. So, and you hit on a key point there, that is the content in this case was limited because perhaps the designer or the teacher felt like they had to package it in a certain way because of the way it was delivered, right?
Mostly it was prepackaged.
Prepackaged, right.
And therefore easily replaceable.
Right, so the design, it was all in the design of how it was delivered to the student. And that's a point, thank you, I didn't plant him either, so it's perfect, thank you. It's a perfect segue. So some of the issues with, I'm going to elaborate on that very point here in a second, but some of the issues with media comparison studies, they really lack a theoretical basis so that, these correspondence students versus these students here in the classroom, there's no theory behind that. It's an evaluation, right? It's not research. And they're confounding variables. As you were mentioning, the design of the instruction, was impacted because of the way the designer or the teacher, whoever designed it, put it together. Maybe there was a shortage of time, or maybe there was a certain way the students had to receive it, or a certain time frame in which they had to process it, or that feedback could be given. There are any number of variables that can impact the outcome of that kind of a study, right? And so there's confounding. Most of these studies result in no significant difference, okay? And there are hundreds of them, beginning back in the 1800s and going on still today. So with every new innovation becomes a focus of the next comparison. And so even there are these meta-analyses of no significant difference studies, and they don't tell us anything, really. And beyond that, do you know this computing term? Garbage in equals garbage out? Okay. Well, if you ask a bad question, you get a worthless answer, right? So the unfortunate thing is, these results are interpreted to mean something. They're interpreted to mean that this educational experience is as good as. Well, just because somebody's found not guilty, does that mean they're not guilty? No, it means there's not enough evidence. Okay, so we can interpret things differently based on our perspective, but unfortunately, these studies where there's no significant difference are sort of leveraged to mean that this experience was at least as good as something we can get in a classroom. Well, again, where's the value in comparing? But this causal leap was unjustified, really. It really just meant the treatment didn't have any effect, and the media is not a treatment, okay? So the analyses reveal these confounding variables of media features and the instructional strategy, right? It's the strategy that matters. So media are really, as you were saying earlier, media are the vehicles that instantiate the strategy. I'm going to design a lesson to deliver to you, and as the designer, I think I would like to do some collaborative groups. And as you were talking about earlier, how can I leverage this delivery system to organize people into groups and to carry out my plans for the instruction? That's where the value is, and there's where the questions need to be asked. So what are the good questions? So we have some micro-level issues, and we have some macro-level issues. So I look at micro-level issues as more basic research. There's great value in basic research, but I'm going to focus my efforts in a few minutes on more applied research here. But we're still into asking some basic research questions at the micro level. So we can look at media and look at what really makes a difference, like we've been talking about. Like, what are the features or the attributes of media? I'll talk about that in a minute. And how can these systems instantiate or deliver or carry out our design plans? And what are the characteristics of our audience, by the way? Doesn't that matter? As we were talking about, you know, so much of what happens with regard to learning comes in the door with the students, as we were talking about earlier in the second presentation this morning. So how do we account for that, and how do we design for that? How do we plan effective instruction based on what we know about the learners? And then we have macro level issues. We can look at our systems, we can analyze them and think, what can they do? How can they help support our what we bring in terms of designing effective learning experiences? And then we also need to explore these contextual factors like we were talking about, not just focus on these very basic research questions, but look more broadly to include the sociological, the cultural context of learning, and examine these related issues. Okay, so let's go back to basic research for a minute. I want to make sure I'm staying on time here. So one of the ways, when I work with faculty on campus, one of the things I try to help them do in terms of thinking about the quality of online learning, because they're very concerned about the learning experience that students get as distance learners. When we're at Virginia Tech and we're putting courses online, and sometimes I help faculty with that, and they're concerned, they're always asking, you know, how can I make sure that it's as good as in the classroom? Well, what I try to emphasize is, let's look at what learning outcomes you're targeting, and let's look at the delivery mode that we have, in this case, probably an asynchronous course management system. What are the features or attributes of that system that we can leverage to support what you want to do? Okay. So, So you can look at levels of realism and abstraction. If I'm teaching a very complicated subject that involves a lot of detail, that involves maybe an immersive environment, you know, does my environment support that? We have to look at issues such as, you know, color versus black and white. Sometimes color can be used very effectively to provide visual cues. And these are very basic kinds of questions that are still being investigated. We can think about whether or not motion is needed. Are we teaching a process? Are we teaching something sequential? Does the system have the ability to support this? And then how does the system support our instructional strategies? And I've put a few up here for you. If I wanted to demonstrate, do I have the capability to do it? Can I do it live? Can they ask me questions? Can I zoom in? Can I show step by step? How does the system support my ability to carry out my plans? Can I engage the learners in problem-based learning if I want to do that based on the kinds of features of the system? Can we collaborate? Can we collaborate in real time? Doesn't matter. If our learners are around the world and we have all these time differences, how can I organize a learning event using the features of the system to support those plans? How can I consider the cognitive styles and the motivation and the self-efficacy and the cultural influences of the learners that I'm working with? And how can I take that into consideration? All right, you know what, I'm gonna zip along here. We're gonna put my slides online here so you can look at some of the, I have some of the most recent research outcomes related to some current innovations in technologies for learning, such as adaptive learning systems, which I mentioned have actually been around for a long, long time. But these kinds of systems, as you can see, can enhance learner performance. But there's a very heavy investment, front-end design investment. So in each of these, I have tried to indicate what some of the benefits are as well as some of the challenges. Mobile learning, of course, is still very popular. It's been popular for a while, but you can imagine some of the challenges in designing learning experiences for a screen that's this big. You know, imagine trying to design that animation so you can see it. Now, maybe it would be better on an iPad because the feature of the tool would be, you know, more space. But anyway, just some considerations there. I want to get to the next generation of research. I believe, you know, we'll probably have some more of the same kinds of comparisons that we've had for a while. And this is from the 2010 National Educational Technology Plan, that there's an interest in the kind of personalized learning systems that we were talking about earlier, but also they want to make sure that these systems produce content expertise and competencies that are equal to or better than those produced by the best conventional instruction. So there's still this kind of notion we have to validate what we do by comparing it to what we do face-to-face as the gold standard. All right, personalized learning environment. So a big interest in the federal Department of Education. By the way, the Department of Education just funded a $3 million comparison study for WestEd Lab to compare the use of Khan Academy in math classes to the non-use of Khan Academy in California community college systems. I hope they'll take the time to look at what variables might matter, like, I don't know, time on task or additional practice, feedback, the kinds of gains we can get from additional engagement, additional application of content to practice. Okay, but what I hope for the future is that our research, we can look at research related to motivation, just like we were talking about before lunch. How can we engage learners? How can we increase interest in and excitement about learning? I'm going to just show you this one video, Bryce, the virtual humans. This is leveraging some research on virtual humans that have been used in the military to engage learners in science education. This is at the Boston Science Museum.
Hello? Hello. Is there something we can help you with? Who are you? My name's Ada. And I'm Grace. We're your virtual museum guides. With your help, we can suggest exhibits that will get you thinking, or answer questions about things you may have seen here. What do you want to learn about?
What can I do with here?
Here at Computer Place, you can command a robot to do a Mars mission and program another one at Robot Park. And don't forget the one that remembers meeting you. What do you want to do first?
How do you understand what people are saying?
We're virtual humans. We use speech recognition technology to identify your words and use statistics to figure out the meaning of the words based on context. Once we know what you're talking about, we'll reply appropriately. The same way you ask a question or tell a story to your friends is the same way you can speak to us. As long as we're speaking the same language, we can speak it naturally. Like, you could ask, "Where's Robot Park?" Or, "Could you tell me where Robot Park is?" Both are looking for the same answer.
How did you get your names?
Our namesakes are Ada Lovelace and Grace Hopper. Yeah, they may be old-fashioned names, but both are from the most modern computing women of their time. In the 1800s, Ada Lovelace predicted that computers would someday help us write music and create art. And in this past century, Grace Hopper created a type of computer program called a compiler, which helps people tell computers what to do. It could be said that Ada inspired Grace. Or that Grace did all the work, in which case our names are perfect.
Do you have boyfriends?
Why? Is there another virtual human you think we should meet? I hope they're into neural networks and amino acid sequences. Grace, what's wrong with just charming and generous?
Okay, that's all. Goodbye.
Thanks for coming by. Have a great time with all the exhibits at Computer Place. I look forward to seeing you again. We can stay connected at mos.org in the meantime. Have fun!
Okay, so you can access this link online too through the presentation. But anyway, these are virtual humans that not only present to you, but they engage with you based on what your interests are. There's a lot of natural language processing that's been programmed into these agents, and so they try to work with you to determine what you might be interested in seeing and then direct you to those kinds of exhibits. Okay. All right, and I also hope to echo Tom Reeves, who made quite a splash in our field back in the 1980s when he called for more socially responsible research. And this is where I think we can really resonate with the theme of this conference in trying to focus our efforts on social justice. Some of the research we can do. These are a few of the projects I've been very fortunate to be involved in. One, to preserve Native American language and culture through the use of local tribal legends to teach dying indigenous languages back to English-speaking Native kids, right, through multimedia. So they get into the program, they hear the language, the indigenous language, and they see it. Sometimes it uses different syllabary than our English language here, and they can have some opportunity to play around with it. And this is more socially appropriate from indigenous communities' perspectives, because there's a sort of a taboo against showing up other people. So westernized language teaching methods are not culturally appropriate. So instead of me calling on you to stand up and say, how about if you tell us the days of the week, you know? This is a whole language approach that lets the kids get comfortable with the language first before they're asked to demonstrate their own performance. Another instance is using distance education to develop human capacity in Malawi. So I did some work with a teacher education group in Malawi to design a system to get out into the rural communities to help teacher professional development. There aren't a lot of opportunities there for such experiences. So we took our online program in instructional technology and converted it to a print-based program. So sort of retrofitting. But the key investigation in this experience for me was looking at and being sure to incorporate the local and cultural context in this design process. Not just the end result, but involving our indigenous partners in Malawi to make sure that the solutions we created with them are culturally appropriate. And then using game-based instruction to increase girls' interest in IT careers in the Appalachian area, down where I'm from in the western part of Virginia, in that area down there. Again, another very rural community, but we're using a web-based game to help girls become more knowledgeable about these careers, because there's such a deficit of women in IT careers, especially in that area. So we're using the motivational power of games and the access of the internet to push these kinds of experiences out to girls to reach them where they are. All right, so in closing, I'd like to say that we can be hopeful that instructional technology research will be informed by the past and then explore meaningful issues that really contribute to solving contemporary problems, and then help make a difference in the future. Okay?